Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Cheyenne resident Don Alston retired from the United States Air Force in 2012. In his last assignment, General Alston was in charge of the nation's Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force here at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne. He is an expert in nuclear deterrence. Wyoming Chronicle sits down with General Alston and discusses nuclear deterrence and its impact on Wyoming, next on Wyoming Chronicle.
Support for Wyoming PBS is provided by the Matthew and Virgie O. Dragisevich Wyoming Foundation Trust, honoring the rich history and heritage of Wyoming.
It's our pleasure to be joined with Major General Don Alston. Don retired from the Air Force in 2012. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wyoming Chronicle. Welcome.
Great to be with you.
We're here in a place that's familiar to you. We're in the museum of F.E. Warren Air Force Base, a place that you used to command.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, my last assignment in the Air Force, I was the commander of 20th Air Force. And as a matter of fact, to put it in perfect context, I was a tenant to the wing commander here on the base. But that wing was part of 20th Air Force, along with the wing up in Montana and the wing of Minuteman missiles in North Dakota as well. So it was a great last assignment. Didn't know it would be our last assignment until my wife and I made that decision, but it was a great place to retire.
And now you still live here in Cheyenne and have certainly become one of the nation's experts on what nuclear deterrence is. And that's what we want to talk about today on what is here at F.E. Warren Air Force Base relative to ICBMs that are under control and the deterrence it provides our country's nuclear deterrence policy. Right. And you're an expert with that. Give us a background, General, if you would, on why did ICBMs come to Wyoming?
It's a good question and a great place to start. I think we have to go all the way back to the Manhattan Project just to set the baseline on what was going on in the 40s. And then when America gets the nuclear weapon, and we employ the nuclear weapon at the end of World War II against Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. After that happens, there's only one country in the world that has this capability. We have a nuclear monopoly. We think that's going to last for a while. And lo and behold, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonates a nuclear weapon. We now found out later, of course, that they had spies, they had folks that were in Los Alamos and other places, and they could accelerate their capabilities. So we were surprised. But the only means we had to deliver that weapon was through a long-range bomber. But there was lots of tension in the world. In the late 40s, the Soviets decided to strangle Berlin, and so what do? We deploy the B-29 to England to send a signal, to begin signaling with nuclear capabilities. The nuclear-capable bomber went to the United Kingdom. And of course, the Berlin airlift successfully was able to let the air out of that crisis in a way that confrontation was limited. But throughout the 50s, we had challenges in the world where people would wonder whether or not nuclear weapons would be part of a conversation. There were challenges in Hungary, an uprising, and the Soviets maintain a large conventional force. We demobilized after wars, after World War I and after World War II. And so given the size of the Soviet force in Europe, in particular, this threat, Eisenhower decided to challenge it not with a comparable size conventional force, but to find a way to leverage nuclear capabilities to reduce that threat and that vulnerability to the United States. And then when Sputnik happened on October 4th, 1957, suddenly the world got smaller. And if the Soviets could launch a satellite, could they put a nuclear weapon on top of a rocket? And then how much time would the United States have to react? So we only had what turned out to be one means to deliver nuclear weapons, and it was strategic bombers. We had to find another way. So we had urgent development in the mid to late 50s of ballistic missiles. We put a priority on intermediate range ballistic missiles because it was a hard problem to solve the distance for an intercontinental ballistic missile. So we had programs called Thor and Jupiter, where we would forward deploy these missiles that didn't have the range to reach Moscow from the United States, but could reach Moscow from the United Kingdom. And so we did that. We deployed Thor to the United Kingdom, and then we accelerated the intercontinental ballistic missile. And then ultimately, we had to do site selection, and F.E. Warren was one site chosen to deploy the first intercontinental ballistic missile that America had, and that was the Atlas missile. And so that came here in the late 50s.
And it's been active in that mission ever since.
Right.
The Atlas was first. Give us a history lesson on what followed.
Well, the Atlas missile was kind of a high maintenance proposition here. It ultimately, a squadron consisted of 3 missiles and 1 launch control center at the very beginning. And then ultimately, when we moved from the Atlas D to the Atlas E, then we could have 9 missiles associated with a squadron. So the numbers were small. But when you look at a map of where we deployed the Atlas missile, a lot of it seemed to circle around, 500 miles or so around Omaha, which was the headquarters for Strategic Air Command. And missile development was moving very fast. It was in the late 50s, I think 1958, when we made a commitment to the Minuteman I missile. Why was this important? Well, there's a big distinction between the Atlas missile, which was, the vernacular was a coffin launch, where it's laid down horizontally until crisis, and then it's erected, then it has to be fueled, and then the guidance was not on board the missile. The guidance had to be fed to the missile from the Launch Control Center. So this was a very challenging and time-critical way to manage nuclear deterrence. But the Minuteman brought several different characteristics. It was inertial guidance, so now the missile had the guidance on board all the time. It was solid fuel, so it was fueled all the time, and it had a very rapid reaction time. And in addition to that, it also would be widely dispersed. We were going to dig a lot of holes. We were going to deploy a lot of ICBMs to make a targeting challenge for our opponent. And so while we are in the early stages of deploying the Atlas missile, we have begun work preparing to deploy the Minuteman. And one thing I found very interesting, of all of those sites for the Atlas missile, only one site converted to Minuteman, and that was here at F.E. Warren. And we've had ICBMs at F.E. Warren ever since the late 50s. Minuteman, the Atlas only lasted from till 1965. In the spring of 1965, the last one came out, and the Minuteman I was on alert. And then we converted to later editions of the Minuteman as time went on.
Fast forward now to today.
Right.
How many Minutemans are controlled here at F.E. Warren?
Right now there's 150 Minuteman IIIs here. So we moved from the Minuteman I, jumped over the Minuteman II, that was deployed in other locations. And in about 1970, the Minuteman III came to F.E. Warren. And that then was also, they had 200 launch facilities around F.E. Warren, supported by this wing. And so we converted one of those 50 missile squadrons to the Peacekeeper weapon system from 1986 through about 2005, and then we deactivated that.
The Peacekeeper with multiple warheads.
It had it was the most potent intercontinental ballistic missile America ever deployed. It had 10 warheads. It had a high nuclear yield on top of each one of them, and it had exquisite guidance. The accuracy was phenomenal. And but it was one of a kind, and we had America had designs on deploying more of those, but we only did one squadron, and it was only ever here. And when we took that down, we still had 150 missiles, and so at the 3 remaining ICBM wings that America has, we have 150 Minuteman III missiles at each one of them. The START II treaty, which never went into force, was the DMIRV treaty, and so this was negotiated in the early 90s. And
so when you describe a MIRV, that's a weapon with multiple warheads. Today's Minuteman III missiles just have 1 warhead per missile.
Right. And we have maintained the technical capability to upload additional warheads if the stability in the world and the geostrategic factors make that the right thing to do for our nation. We could upload more warheads if that is the direction. But for the sake of stability and the sake of reducing our weapons, we decided to go download to just 1 warhead. So this START II treaty that would have been the means to take the multiple warheads off of America's ICBMs and off of the Russian ICBMs never went into force because, from the Russian perspective, President George W. Bush abrogated the anti-ballistic missile treaty at the turn of the century. And when he did that, Russia says, we're not going to follow through on START 2. But right after that, we began negotiations on what was called the Moscow Treaty. And that further reduced from the low 2000s that both of us would have deployed to numbers closer to 1,700 or so deployed warheads. And so technically, you can't score the reduction of Peacekeeper against START 2, but we did take into account the reduction of that many warheads as part of the Moscow Treaty as well. And so then fast forward to 2010 and the Nuclear Posture Review and the New START Treaty that were both, the treaty was negotiated at that time, and we did a concurrent Nuclear Posture Review. The treaty set overall top limits, and America decided how we would divvy those up between the sub force, the bomber force, and the ICBM force. And we got to 400 deployed ICBMs through the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review.
Let's talk about the Triad for just a moment. Why is it important for America today to still have land-based nuclear missiles when we can deliver by other means, either by long-range bombers or through submarines?
Well, the countries had a triad, or had these three means to deliver nuclear weapons since about 1960 or so. This had to do with how well we could miniaturize or make smaller nuclear weapons so they could be carried in a submarine or on top of a intercontinental ballistic missile and effectively hold targets at risk 8,000 miles away. And so when you invest in something like a triad, where the attributes of the bomber force are, it's so flexible. We can signal with a bomber. With the tensions we've had with North Korea, what the Air Force and the Department of Defense did was they deployed a B-2 or a B-52 to fly over the Korean Peninsula, and we ensured that the media said a nuclear-capable bomber flew over. So we have been communicating with Russia and the former Soviet Union with, and they do this too, with the movement of bombers. You can see it, it's in plain sight, and it's a very effective way to signal and to make a point. You can't see and maneuver the ICBM force so well. And some would say, well, look, they're fixed targets. Aren't they vulnerable?
You can go to Wikipedia and see exactly where everyone is located.
Exactly. And those that we're trying to deter, we want them to know that they're there. We want them to see activity. We want them to see the amount of sweat equity that it takes every day to keep this force, this alert force, up to roughly 99% available to the president every day. And so we disperse those out over roughly more than 30,000 square miles. That's a lot of area that needs to be covered from an opponent's targeting perspective. And then the submarines that we have sufficient number of submarines that some of them are they're underway in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. They, so far, you can't find these submarines unless you accidentally come upon them. And so they are a very secure retaliatory force. You can't target them outright, but since they can't be targeted, they would be able to respond to a nuclear attack, even if our bomber bases were attacked or our missile fields were attacked. So the amount of money that's required and technology to hold those three legs of the triad at risk, it is such a difficult problem to solve for an adversary that we feel very secure. It's hard to take that force out, and if the president requires it, we will achieve the attack effects that the president demands.
Do you see deterrence as being something that's necessary for years and decades to come, and specifically a nuclear deterrence?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, deterrence is not a complicated subject. It's about trying to ensure that you create a perception in your opponent's mind that the cost of achieving or pursuing its political problem he's trying to solve or a political advantage he's trying to gain would never be worth the cost. And this can't be something that an adversary would wake up today and say, is it close today? Is today the day that I could pursue that aggressive behavior? It has to be compelling every day. that not today's the answer. And so you've got to have a force that is of sufficient force structure that this is not in doubt, that we are fully committed. And such an important signal is manifested by the size of that force, conveying to our friends and allies that we have their back. Because so many of our friends and allies do not possess nuclear weapons on the promise that the United States will successfully deter, and if deterrence fails, that we would be willing to employ a nuclear weapon in their defense. And it's a challenging calculus, but it's one that we've been able to preserve now for decades.
A chilling calculus as well.
Yes, sir.
Terrorism. You read recently about terrorism and its potential to play a role in the world's nuclear future. Does that concern you a lot? Is it something you worry about?
Well, the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, which, by the way, I was the senior Air Force person in the Pentagon that would sit at the table as we were doing the hard work of responding to the treaty negotiations going on overseas, as well as trying to construct a nuclear posture review that the administration wanted to have. And the number one concern that was articulated in the 2010 posture review was that the greatest threat was nuclear terrorism. Now, the newest nuclear posture review, released last February 2018, that in fact says we're back to great power competition. It doesn't dismiss the risks associated with nuclear terrorism with nuclear weapons from these rogue elements. But here's the concern that I think everyone has with that. You can't hold groups that don't necessarily have any connection to a particular nation state at risk directly. But you can hold the states at risk who would be able to provide them capabilities to achieve those nuclear effects. It's really difficult to make a nuclear weapon. And so it would require state sponsorship in order to get down that path. So I think I'm certainly concerned about nuclear terrorism, to use that expression. But I also agree that the larger threat to our nation today is great power competition.
You mentioned great power competition. We have woken up in the last week about Russia and the United States not going forward with the INF treaty, the mid-range nuclear treaty. We've heard, headlines that talk now about arms races. Is that something you see in our future? Are we going to be in a nuclear arms race again?
Well, I think it's a fair risk that could happen. But let's talk about the two treaties that have really made the news. The principal one that we see is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that was signed by Gorbachev and Reagan in the late 80s. And it took out an entire class of ground launch nuclear weapons that had a range up to about 5,500 kilometers, roughly 3,000 miles or so. And this was all kind of a European-centric problem that we were solving with the INF Treaty. And
at the time, we had nuclear weapons in Europe.
We did. We had the Ground Launch Cruise Missile and the Pershing II, and those two weapon systems were eliminated by this treaty. And Russia complied on their side of it as well. Over the last almost maybe 10 years, the United States has been accusing Russia of having a cruise missile, a ground-launched cruise missile, that fits the characteristics of that class of missiles that was eliminated by the INF Treaty, that in fact they've been testing and now deploying battalions of this capability to Europe. Russia denies that these are in violation of that treaty. We do not have any capability that fits in that box that is the INF Treaty. And up to this point, we have not seen a need for that when we're looking at our competitor in Europe principally, which would be Russia. The reality is, though, we've had a proliferation of weapons with this range around the world. And when you consider nuclear proliferation and proliferation of this missile capability, even the United States has challenges in other parts of the world where maybe this capability would be useful. But I think that needs to be studied because there is not an imperative at this time, or we would have been in pursuit of it at this time. And then the other treaty, of course, is the strategic related treaty, which is called the New START Treaty. And that treaty goes through 2021 with the option to extend it for, I think, an additional 5 years. And so should this condition with the INF treaty, will that help precipitate walking away from the opportunity to extend the New START treaty? One of the things that I think we have to think about, though, is last spring, Putin starts talking about a variety of capabilities that I don't know how credible they are, but from unlimited range torpedoes to all kinds of
hypersonic maneuverable weapons.
Very destabilizing weapons, to be sure, if they come to fruition. But when you look at all that, depending on how fast they get to market, how fast they would reach maturity enough to get deployed, the New START treaty right now is insufficient to capture those. And I think it's important for our nation, as well as for Russia, to have frameworks to capture risks that, if unconstrained, can lead to this kind of an arms race that we had in the 60s and the 70s, where ultimately the United States and the Soviet Union topped off at between 30 and 35,000 nuclear weapons. And we've reduced virtually 85 or 90% of that stockpile. I don't think it's in anybody's best interest for those numbers to go back up.
Are there any United States-Russian nuclear weapons negotiations ongoing today?
Directly with weapons, I would say no new negotiations, but there are, underneath the New START treaty, there is contact on a regular basis. And that's to sort of support the ongoing implementation of the treaty. They will come to F.E. Warren, and they may have a quibble with this or that. And so,
they do come here.
And they do. They come here in order for them to fulfill their obligations under the treaty. The wing prepares for that. They get very little notice. And when they get notice, there are protocols on what the wing must immediately start to do in order to prepare to receive the inspectors. But, and we do the same thing over there. And so that's our right to fulfill our duties under the treaty. But underneath that are provisions for the two sides to continue open dialogue about concerns that either one might have about what they saw during any one of their visits. So that framework continues all the time. And then there are other variety of treaties that are tangential to the direct New START treaty, like there's an Open Skies treaty that allows us to fly over Russia and allows Russia to fly over us. And so those are surveillance opportunities for both of our countries. And all of this is about risk reduction. It's about transparency. It's about accountability. And so all these things feed a level of trust, which is what the intention is of having viable, executable, enforceable arms control frameworks.
What should Wyomingites think about when President Trump negotiates with North Korea? How might that impact what happens here at F.E. Warren, for example?
I think the most direct way that our current engagement with North Korea affects all of our nuclear capability, our strategic capabilities, is that region is destabilizing every time Kim Jong-un begins to rattle his saber. Now, he has not done missile tests of late. He has not done nuclear weapons detonations of late. But it's a difficult neighborhood that he is in the middle of, stirring the pot. And you've got Japan that has all the technology and the capacity to have its own domestic organic nuclear weapons program, if not overnight, in a very short amount of time. You have South Korea, where the United States had forward deployed nuclear weapons until the early 90s when we withdrew them, looking across the border at an unstable situation. You have China, which does not welcome the increased American presence in the Western Pacific as we counter this particular threat. And I think the stability, as we try to fortify stability at whatever level we have out there, what contributes to that is the credibility of our deterrence back home. And as the forces, as the men and women at F.E. Warren and all of our nuclear bases do their job well every day, it fortifies deterrence, it fortifies our assurance of our allies that our capabilities are credible, that our people are capable, and that our extended deterrence promise is valid and viable. And so insofar as our forces perform as they do every day so well at home, it contributes to stability, because that shadow that's cast every day by our nuclear force, in particular by America's alert force, which is embodied in the ICBM force, that contributes to stability every day.
How long will there be, do you believe, nuclear weapons, ICBMs, here in the West, specifically here in Wyoming?
Well, I think that mankind has a very poor track record in terms of finding means to kill each other, and so I think history, you can show examples of, going from rocks to bows to tanks. And then ultimately, today's ultimately destructive power is embodied in the nuclear weapon. And that now can't be put back in the box. And so the knowledge is out there. So it would be difficult it's not to say it's impossible, but of course it would be difficult for the world to rid itself of nuclear weapons. And so I guess what I would say, and I hope it doesn't come off as too fatalistic, but until we find a more deadly way to hold each other at risk, then I think that we are going to need to answer the challenge, the vulnerabilities, and the risks with whatever it takes to do that. Today, the way we do that is having a highly capable, highly competent nuclear force. Fortunately for our country, the men and women here at FE Warren, and all of those men and women that are part of America's nuclear enterprise are very well trained and do this job so well every day. I sleep very well every night.
You have a good segue for us. We'll have a chance to visit and meet the men and women who are here at FE Warren later on this year, and we're very much looking forward to understanding what their mission is and how they execute their mission each and every day. So, General Alston, it's been a pleasure to visit with you, and thank you so much for joining us today on Wyoming Chronicle.
I enjoyed it, Craig. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Support for Wyoming PBS is provided by the Matthew and Virgie O. Dragisevich Wyoming Foundation Trust, honoring the rich history and heritage of Wyoming.